So I'm trying to problematize this kind of a situation, that is it just enough to just talk about the concepts and the context in the sense, in what in what kind of setting did this work happen? Is it separate from the work itself? Is it fair to separate the two? Because these ideas are fed by larger notions of science as universal, right? Science is known as something universal. For example, the idea of reproducibility in research, the idea of objectivity, right? The idea of reproducibility in the sense that if I do an experiment here in Bangalore, and if someone else in Kolkata does it, they should get the same results, right? And these kind of ideas, and we have been, I think, the public discourse on science in our country, there is a lot of things for us to do. And I think just like Bitasta has been working on the interface of science and society, and of course so many others in our country, there is a lot of work to do on in this space of relation between science and society. And this is nothing new, of course. Many people have been talking about these ideas, but for some reason these ideas haven't really entered the public discourse, in the sense popular discourse, popular stuff that is discussed, right, in everyday kind of parlance, or even in school textbooks, I would say. So school science and science research, say research that happens within the walls of IISc, these two have remained kind of separate from each other, although there is so much to learn from both sides, I feel. So that is the kind of space that I am looking at in my work in science education, because I feel this is something that can make learning science more meaningful rather than just more effective, no, effective in that sense. So I would like to start my talk. Actually, I would like to start. So I think my video will go off now, but I would like to start by remembering Professor Venkatraman from the physics department of IISc, who passed away earlier this year, and untimely demise, and it was a shock for everyone. He was a wonderful teacher. He was a wonderful scientist, a great person, treated everyone with a lot of respect and listened to everyone, and very encouraging. So I don't I remember I his students and everyone, his colleagues and everyone who's come in touch with him. I think he used to go for the planetarium programs very often. So he has been interacting with students for such a long time, and it's a big loss. I would like to remember a talk that he gave, I think in 2000, late 2014, when the Nobel Prize of Physics was announced for the discovery slash invention of blue LEDs, and he had given this very wonderful talk, and he had given a very nice, a wonderful background of the work, of why this work was important, both in terms of technology and in terms of science. So I want to start by remembering Professor Venkatraman, and I hope he keeps inspiring all of us um, in the times to come, in these very difficult times, especially. Okay. So yes, I would like to start my talk. So longish title, right? So I hope I'm able to do justice to this very long title. Uh, but basically, our story can start, uh, say, from these ideas that came from natural philosophers. Uh, Basically, Greek. I'm talking about people from Greece because I'm not aware of other stuff. I want to learn about other stuff, but basically, I'm talking about these Greeks and ideas like all of these names, right? Although Descartes and Kepler are relatively modern, but Aristotle, say Aristotle is beaten by everyone in science education now for his wrong notions. But Aristotle came from the school of Athens, right? Which was kind of founded by Socrates. This idea that you can talk, you can discuss, you ask questions and counter questions, and you keep going on. And Socrates famously said that I know nothing is the first point to start with, any kind of discussion, any kind of contemplation on, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that the roots of modern science are also in natural philosophy, in the works of philosophers. But while we are talking about light, all of these very influential people thought that light doesn't take any time to go from one place to another. Okay, starting from Aristotle up to Descartes, and even after Descartes, people after Descartes. So as we know, Descartes is known for his work in philosophy. He did a lot of work in natural philosophy as well. So he has interesting work in that region also. But on the other hand, there were others who said that no, it need not be so. It might take a finite amount of time to go from one place to another. Okay, Empedocles was a Greek, I feel. Ibn Sina, Al-Haytham, also known as Avicenna and Alhazen, I think, to the Latinized names of these Arabic scientists of the, I think, 1000 AD, around that time. Fermat, we know. Galileo, of course. Robert Hooke, Hooke's law, right? So all of these people believe that no, it takes a finite amount of time. So there were these two camps. The first camp was more influential, and in fact, Aristotle's words are famous. You know, it says, yeah, light seems to be due to the presence of something is there. Okay, light, something is there, but it's not definitely nothing to do with something going from one place to another. You know, movement that way. Okay, that is what Aristotle has said, is said to be argued, which was problematized by other philosophers and scientists, if you can say that. So Galileo, of course, known for many things. He's, I think, Einstein has called him the father of physics, or father of science, something of that sort. And in this kind of sketch here, engraving rather, there are three characters in Galileo's book. This was a book for which he got into a lot of trouble, dialogue concerning the two main world systems. And these three characters are, one is called Simplicio, after the Greeks, basically Aristotle and others. Another is called Sagredo, who is like a layman who is trying to learn new things. And the third person who Galileo kind of fashioned after his kind of alter ego. His name is Salviati. So he wrote these books which were written in the last decade of his life, two books especially. He wrote them in the form of conversations between these three characters. Okay, but why are we talking about Galileo? Because in his, I think this was his last book, for which he had basically had to take the manuscript out of Italy and try to get people to publish them. Finally, someone in Holland published it. The name of the publisher was Elsevier, not related to the Elsevier publishers we know, but yeah, it's probably they are using his name. So this book was published in 1638, 4 years before he died, and the name in it's in Italian. It says Discourses and Demonstrations, Mathematical Demonstrations about two new sciences. He's talking about the sciences of mechanics and movement or motion, something, and many interesting stuff he's given in this. So this is a very interesting dialogue about light that he says. So Sagredo, the layman, says that he doesn't believe in this, all these Aristotelian ideas that it doesn't like take any time to go from one place to another. But this Salviati, who is basically Galileo, says that yeah, this does raise many questions, but how can we find out, basically what kind of experiment can we do, that those kind of questions. Then Simplicio, who is Aristotelian kind of peripatetic philosopher, says that why he believes that light doesn't take, because he, when you fire a gunshot or something, first you hear the sound and then you first you see the light and then you hear the sound, which means that sound takes some time, but light comes immediately. To which Galileo, or you can say Sagredo, replies that yeah, all that is fine, but it only tells me that it's faster than sound. It doesn't tell me whether it came immediately, light came immediately, or it took some time. It's not enough data, basically. So Salviati, who is basically Galileo, proposes an experiment. This is 1638, and that two people standing on two hills with two lanterns covered with black cloth, the first person uncovers his lantern, so light starts coming out of that lantern. He starts his clock, okay, some kind of a clock. He starts measuring time. Then the other person on the other hill, which is a mile away, when he sees the light coming from the first person, he uncovers his lamp, and then this light starts traveling to the towards the first person. And when this first person sees the other light, he stops his clock and finds the time it took for light to go 1 mile and come back, basically 2 miles. And he claims that he did this experiment, but he couldn't really get any kind of consistent results as such. Okay, and this was 1638. He died in 4 years. In 1638, he was almost blind. Actually, he was under house arrest and almost blind. But after he died, the Academy of Science in Florence, which is the home region of Galileo, tried out the same experiment, and again they couldn't get any kind of conclusive, results as such. So, and then I'm not done with Galileo's book yet. Salviati, who is Galileo, says that he feels that there is a finite speed of light, although he couldn't measure it. He tries to argue by saying that when you have a cloud, when you're looking at clouds from far away, and you see a lightning flash going from one cloud to the other cloud, and basically when you can see that the lightning starts from one place and ends in another place within those clouds. So he feels that, which means that if light didn't take any time to go from one place to another, then this wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have seen this. But I think this is not a very perfect argument. Anyway, we'll go ahead. But then we come to our person, Ole Romer, who is Danish, right? He, all the way from Copenhagen uh, to Paris, long journey, passing through so many different princely states of Germany, through the Netherlands and all that, coming to Paris. Why did he come to Paris? No? So, and he's known for the person to be the person who measured the speed of light, right? So, so why was he in Paris in 1672, which is like 30 years after Galileo died? What brought him to Paris, right? Well, so basically, there was around that time, I think 1498 was Vasco da Gama coming to India, right? Calicut. And around the same time, Columbus and other people, seafaring was a big thing. This was 100 years before Galileo, right? Uh, Around 1500. So seafaring, trading, and of course the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, I think was founded in 1600. So for all of these European states, going to sea was very important, and navigating was very important. Finding the latitude was kind of easy. um, it's really like weird how late in life I came to know about how to find the latitude. But one of the in the northern hemisphere, for example, it's easy to find the latitude if you can just basically locate the pole star. On the north pole, the pole star will be overhead. At the equator, the pole star would be at the horizon, and any intermediate point, the angle that the pole star makes with the horizon would be the latitude of that place. That is one way. Another way is to find uh, you know um, the basically finding using a sundial. Basically a sundial can tell us stuff about the latitude. At different latitudes we'll get different patterns of the shadow of the sundial and so on. But this was kind of weird, that what was happening there. For okay, this is a really weird example which is here. This person called Cabral, who was going to the East Indies, basically Indonesia, Southeast Asia, turned west to catch wind, okay, in the sails, and ended up landing in the on the coast of Brazil. So it was really very dangerous, and I think many ships were lost. Many ships used to just travel straggling the coastline, because in the high seas you basically don't have any way of telling the longitude, right? I hope we know what is the longitude, right? So the Spanish crown as well as the Dutch, Holland had announced a prize, and later on, after a few bad accidents, even the British announced a prize to basically how do we find the longitude of any place on the high seas, especially on the high seas. And Galileo thought about this problem, huh? and he proposed a solution which was based on stuff that he did in 1610. What did he do in 1610? So I think this is something that he's really well known for, right? The telescope, right? He made his own telescopes, and then he wrote this book called Sidereus Nuncius, which is the sidereal messenger or starry messenger, right? And this, if you are really, this is a very beautiful book, and obviously I don't know Latin, but there is a recent English translation available on the internet. I forget the name of the author, but it's just available. The person has just put the PDF on his website. It's really beautiful, this book, okay? And he dedicates this book to the Medici. Medici was a royal family, princely family of Florence, and I think Venice also. So, because he was hoping for some kind of patronage from those families, okay, royal families. And how did Galileo came to know? And this is a well-known story, right? This Dutch lens grinder and spectacle maker Lippershey in 1608, he had applied for a patent for a telescope, and Galileo came to know about these things because people used to write letters to each other a lot those days. There weren't many natural philosophers slash scientists, and they used to correspond with each other a lot, which is very interesting. And then he came to know about this, and he made this telescope. I think some of you might know that Galilean telescope was this, at the eyepiece he had a concave lens, and at the objective, that farther lens was a convex lens, and so on. And he improved this model and so on. There are many stories around the telescope also, that he sold his telescopes to merchants in Padua, in Venice, and all that, because they wanted. Obviously, telescope is a useful thing to have. For example, if you are a merchant and you are seeing a ship arriving, what kind of a ship is it? What kind of goods it is getting? According to that, I can raise or lower my rates here in Venice or something. So many. He did some kind of a business in telescopes also. That's a different story. Uh, who was Galileo was also another interesting thing. He started out studying to be a doctor, then got interested in math and natural philosophy and so on. Then he became a tutor. He was basically selling an instrument which was a navigational compass, military and navigational compass. And he ran a boarding house also, in which people who want to learn from him can stay there, pay him the lodging and boarding charges, and learn from him, take his book and go. And interesting stories of Galileo. A lot of work is there. But where did he get his lenses from? Right? This is a question that would naturally arise. He got his lenses. The name of the person who supplied him lenses is known. Person called Ippolito Francini. So he was basically employed by the Grand Duke of Tuscany, which was the Medici family, okay? And he was in charge of one of the workshops, and a famous instrument maker, well known throughout, okay? And lens grinder, spectacle maker also, right? So talking about spectacle making was there in Italy. In fact, uh, there is still, actually, there is a small island, I think it's an island called Maduro, and since the 13th century, there have been lens grinders and glass blowers living on that island, and they still do that work till now. And from the 13th century, like 1200s, from that time, they have been making spectacles. They had been making spectacles and grinding lenses, and they had lens grinding lathes. Very, very, very interesting. So these are not lens grinders. These photos of some frescoes, some paintings, are some people from some religious people, reading some texts and so on. So they have shown these spectacles being used by them. So spectacle making was a big thing, okay, and whoever could afford it used it, okay. And these spectacle makers, lens grinders, were a very close knit communities. They were actually artisanal guilds who guarded their secrets, and they were like very sought after, etc., all that. So one of the things that Galileo found out from looking at the skies with his telescope that he had invented, which he did this kind of looking at the skies, he did in January and February of 1610, and in March he had published his book already. So one of the very important things that he found out, very important, we will come to why it is important, is that he found the moons of Jupiter, which he promptly named as the Medici moons because he wanted to be in the good books of the Medici family, right? These are Galileo's sketches of what he found. The this kind of a disk is Jupiter, and around Jupiter, he sees these spots, which are almost always in the straight line, from which he tried to basically he tried to reason that they are in a straight line, which means that they must be going around Jupiter, because if you look at something from the side, something is going around, say, Jupiter, and if you look at it from the side, from the plane in which they are going around, they will just look as if they are moving in a straight line. Huh? So from this, he was able to kind of postulate that these are probably the moons of Jupiter, satellites of Jupiter, which he named as the Medici moons and so on, and which was actually a very dangerous thing to say at that time, because everything was supposed to go around the Earth. So here was a system where four objects were going around something other than the Earth, namely Jupiter here. So this was a dangerous thing to say at that time, but he didn't get into too much trouble here. Later on, when he talked about how Venus also has phases, just like moon has phases, right? You have the new moon, you have the full moon, you have all the phases in between, and the phases of the moon, you should try to, if I hope most of us are familiar for the reasons why there are phases of the moon, but basically by finding the phases of Venus, which he mentions in his letters. One of the letters is famously written to Kepler, and he mentions is it in the form of a cryptical message. He didn't. He just wanted to put it on record that he's found the phases of Venus, just like the moon goes through phases. Venus also goes through phases, and well, the geocentric model doesn't allow that to happen. Like you need the heliocentric model, namely the sun in the center, to explain the phases of the moon. Anyway, so we'll come to that later if we get time. But I have to move on. So anyway, he found these moons, and he found out also like roughly how much time they take to go around Jupiter. For example, the first moon, which is the closest moon, takes around 42 hours, I think, to go around Jupiter. Okay, 42 hours, like Earth hours, right? Hour, 1.7 days basically to go around Jupiter. So what about this? So Galileo proposed that we can use the moon of Jupiter, Io, the first moon of Jupiter, as a universal clock. What does that mean? Okay, how does it help in solving this so-called longitude problem? No? So this is something which might seem a bit complicated, but basically there is a concept of local noon. The local noon of a place, basically it doesn't matter if you are in Bangalore, if you are in Calcutta, you are in Assam, you are in Gujarat, you are in Andaman, wherever you are, we are all using the Indian Standard Time, right? But the Indian Standard Time, for the Indian Standard Time, for all of these different places which are at different longitudes, the sun is at the highest point in the sky at noon, at different times, at not at the same time. So the idea of local noon is that if you have a stick and you are looking at the shadow of the stick, so when the shadow of the stick is shortest, basically, that is the local noon at that place. Okay. So finding the local noon is not such a big deal. You can always find the local noon using a stick or a what do we call it, sundial, something like that. Okay. So even if you are in some unknown place which with unknown longitude, you can find the local noon. And what he says is that what you do is that, say you want to compare, you want to find the longitude of a place with respect to Paris. So this is another thing which is interesting. We all use the Greenwich meridian, no, as 0 degrees longitude, right? Greenwich, which is in London. So that longitude passing through that place is called as the 0 degrees. Everything else is measured with respect to that. This wasn't so earlier. For example, you could choose any meridian you want. Paris could be a meridian, for example. So if you want to find the longitude of a place with respect to Paris, You basically try to find out, you try to look at, you have a kind of a measuring instrument, for time measuring instrument. You find the time it takes from noon, from the local noon of that place, to say when Io enters the shadow of Jupiter. Okay, because Io only takes 1.7 days to go around Jupiter. There should be like some day when you can do this measurement at night, when you can measure, when you can see when Io enters the shadow of Jupiter. Okay, so if you do this thing, find the difference in the time from the noon, local noon, to the time at which Io enters the shadow of Jupiter. Uh, you can find this difference for, say, do it for the same day in Paris and some other place, and the difference in the times would give you the longitude of that place. For example, why do I say 4 minutes difference for 1 degree longitude? This is simple, because whole one full rotation is 360 degrees, and 24 hours, right? It takes for 360 degrees rotation, right? So you try to figure out how much 1 degree should correspond to how much time. It turns out to be 4 minutes difference. Okay, so this was Galileo's proposal. Although people were kind of not sure whether this will work on a ship, which is kind of heaving and swaying on the high seas, on the waves and all that, but still this was his proposal, which was taken very seriously. And in fact, Galileo got some money for this proposal from the Dutch. In fact, not money. He was supposed to get a gold medal and a chain, but then the Inquisition didn't allow that to happen. Anyway, he was old and he didn't probably need that money. But anyway, so moving on, Galileo died in 1642. Moving on to the 1660s, the another Italian person called Cassini. Probably some we have heard this name Cassini, right? The I think European Space Agency and NASA, they sent spacecraft called Cassini, right? Which has been anyway, Picard was a French fellow. Okay, these people were working on the proposal given by Galileo. Okay, and they were doing these precise measurements. And probably people have heard about this person, Tycho Brahe. He's known for his precise measurements. So his observatory, basically his telescope was placed in a place called Ven, which is close to Copenhagen, an island, and all of his precise measurements were done in that place. Okay, so just to test out this Galileo thingy of using the moon of Jupiter thing, Picard went to Tycho Brahe's observatory to Denmark. Okay, I think Ven is now today in Sweden. This is Sweden, this is Denmark, this is today in Sweden. Anyway, so Tycho Brahe was also a Danish person. Okay, Romer, who was in Copenhagen then, and he went to the university, and his professor, I think Bartholin was his professor. He was also into astronomy and all that. So when Picard came all the way from Paris, and then basically Romer got a chance to accompany Picard to this island where Tycho Brahe's telescope was and all that. And in that time spent together, Picard was very much impressed by him, and he took him along to Paris in 1672. Okay, back in Paris, he became the tutor to the Dauphin, which was basically dolphin. Basically, dolphin is a dolphin. The dolphin, the animal. The dolphin is basically on the coat of arms of the crown prince, basically, of that house. So he became the tutor of the crown prince, and he stayed on for, I think, around 10 years. He did a lot of work besides working with Picard and Cassini on astronomy in the Royal Observatory. And he worked on instrumentation, he improved micrometers, he visited England, met many people there, looked at how they were doing astronomy, what kind of instruments they were using, and all that stuff. So but basically what these people found out is that they were looking at they were making a schedule of when this moon of Jupiter, the first moon of Jupiter, Io, they were making a timetable. Okay, at this particular time, this particular day, Io will enter the shadow of Jupiter, and at this particular time, it will emerge from the shadow and again go around Jupiter and so on. So there was this whole timetable that these people had made. Okay, but then Cassini noted that it doesn't always work according to this timetable. So they made the timetable working on the assumption that, well, say the moon takes 28 days to go around the Earth, right? So basically, this particular satellite EO should also take a fixed amount of time to go around Jupiter. So it should just follow timetable, right? So, but then it wasn't matching, and then sometimes it took more time to enter the shadow. Sometimes it just lagged behind and didn't enter the shadow at the time it's supposed to enter, and so on. So Romer did more observations and more experiments and more work, and then he pondered on this. Why is this happening? And then he finally sent his report to the French Academy. And his idea was this. Okay, basically, when Jupiter and its moons are close to the Earth, uh, it has to travel this much distance. Okay, when Jupiter and its moon are farther from Earth, light, which is sunlight, which is reflected from its moon and Jupiter, has to travel a longer distance, and the extra distance that sunlight has to travel is equal to the diameter of Earth's orbit around the sun. Okay, and basically, if you consider this situation as the or this situation when we have a fixed kind of measurement, then basically for this situation, when it is going farther away from the Earth, Jupiter and Earth, the distance is increasing, then you should get a lag in the actual eclipse of the moon of or not eclipse, I shouldn't use maybe word, basically you're entering the shadow of Jupiter. It should happen a little later. Okay, and he was able to calculate, and he came up with this thing, working with the assumption that light takes a finite amount of time. Light has a finite speed. It doesn't travel with an infinite speed immediately. It takes some time to go from one place to another. According to his calculations, it takes light around 22 minutes.
Anish.
Hello, yeah.
Anish, the PPT has gone.
Oh, okay. I'll present again.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for this. Okay, now. Okay, so basically he's saying that it should take light around 22 minutes to cover this extra distance, which is the diameter of Earth's orbit around the sun. But strangely, he doesn't. So this is the English translation of his paper. Okay, how he has drawn. Okay, this is basically the shadow of Jupiter and moon of Jupiter entering the shadow, coming out of the shadow, etc. All that. I'll tell you about basically there is a very nice book called A Source Book in Physics, written by W.F. Magie, Magie, in 1930 or 1940, which compiles most of the important original scientific work, basically primary sources in English, translated in English. Okay, so but strangely, this person, Romer, doesn't calculate the speed of light. He just gives an explanation for why there is a discrepancy, there is a problem in the schedule, in the timetable. It's only Huygens, and then, well, this is an important thing, that distance to the sun had been recently found out by these people around the same time, a bit before Romer. Distance to the sun, that is another subject. Basically, the Greeks had been trying to find, and a few of them were quite successful also. And okay, this is something which was used by Huygens, and because he calculated the speed of light using Romer's data, so he says, okay, diameter of Earth's orbit is so and so. I divide that distance by the time it takes light to travel that distance, and he came up with a number which is like a bit off. It's only 2/3 of the value of the speed of light we know today, which is around 3 lakh kilometers per second. So his value was around 2 lakh kilometers per second, which is fine, I feel, because for that time, around 350 years ago, that's a great thing to do, I feel. So anyway, but people came to know, soon people came to know that it's not 22 minutes, it's around 16 minutes, and then they got somewhat the right speed of light. Okay. But then what about the longitude problem? Like you can ask me. So basically, there was this person called John Harrison, and Wikipedia describes him this way, okay, self-educated English carpenter and clockmaker who invented the marine chronometer. That's a very fancy name of basically a clock which is very, very precise. Basically, it doesn't lose time or gain time. It just, it's very, very, reliable. So basically, when you go on a ship, you carry a clock with you, and the clock will show you the time at Greenwich in London, okay? And basically from that and finding the difference in the noon and all that stuff, you can get the longitude. Okay, this was solved by this John Harrison. Huh? A very interesting work. Huh? But then what about Galileo's longitude method? What about that? Huh? So yes, people did use it. For example, Cassini himself measured the size of France, and many other stuff. People were still using Galileo's ideas. Okay, it wasn't like lost basically. But then what about Romer, right? You can ask me. Well, Romer was close to the royal family. In fact, the tutor of the crown prince and so on. 1681. So there was like more than 100 years before the revolution. The royals were not in danger that way. So but then he had to leave in 1681 because this so-called Edict of Nantes, basically, which was a law made by the French royal, whatever, the crown, saying that okay, France was a Catholic country. It says that okay, we can allow Protestants to come to our country and work, etc. So that was revoked. So Romer, being from Denmark, a Protestant, had to leave. But then Romer went back to Denmark, continued his work, did a lot of other interesting stuff in measurement, in instrumentation. In fact, became the mayor and the police commissioner of Copenhagen also. So moving on. So this was around 1678, 1681. Romer goes back to Copenhagen. Okay, but then coming a few decades past, people were looking for something else. People were looking for parallax. Okay, so from the time 1610 uh, till 1700s, around a century, a lot of work had been done in improving telescopes, in improving measurement, and for both for various techniques and so on. People were started looking for parallax of stars, and there were reasons why they were looking for parallax, because people were trying to figure out, okay, sorry, people were trying to figure out, say, is there a way to find the distance to the so-called nearest stars using parallax, given that we know the diameter of Earth's orbit, huh? Or parallax could be another evidence for the heliocentric model and so on. But what is parallax, for example? I think we must be aware of parallax. Now, if you look at something from two different places, the background changes, right? And how much the background changes depends on how far away that place is from you. Huh? So they were looking for this kind of a parallax, these astronomers in all over Europe, and they were hoping to find parallax. So somewhere, and basically, this person coming to England now, James Bradley, who trained to be a priest. In fact, he worked as a pastor, a priest, for a vicar also, for a few years before he became the Savilian chair of astronomy at Oxford. But then, well, he was connected. His maternal uncle was, worked with Halley, Edmund Halley, Halley's comet, Isaac Newton, and so on. His maternal uncle was also an astronomer, and so on. So he had this kind of a family kind of background, from right from his probably childhood. He's looking at stuff and talking about people talking about this stuff around him. So anyway, he becomes the chair of astronomy at Oxford, and he has a few collaborators also. I think one of them is French. Um, and then this is, I think I mentioned this book earlier, right? This is what this book talks about. So Bradley and his collaborator, they were looking at a star called Gamma Draconis. Okay, why were they looking at that star? For variety of reasons. One of the reasons was that most of these telescopes were pointed upwards at the zenith, basically pointed vertically upwards. Why? Because that way you can kind of minimize the refraction of light due to the Earth's atmosphere when you point things, vertically upwards. So this was a good candidate, basically, this Gamma Draconis, and a few other stars also. They were not just looking at one star and trying to find parallax, trying to see whether when Earth is on one side of the sun, and when Earth is on the other side of the sun after 6 months, say, do we see any difference in the background of this star, of these stars, say, like Gamma Draconis and so on? Okay, and this is what he says, that yes, he uh, could not find. Basically, he could not find parallax, but then he discovered something else, which was weird, but which was kind of repeated for all the stars that he looked at. All the stars kind of showed a similar value. Basically, the idea was, I'm trying to show this here with this diagram, but I'm not sure how clear this diagram is. Basically, that this blue arrow stands for the motion of the Earth. The Earth moves around the sun, right? The Earth covers a distance of 2 pi r, where r is 150 million kilometers. So 2 pi is around 6.3 into 150. So that's around, I think, a billion kilometers, huh? At least a billion kilometers, I think. Around a billion kilometers in 365 days and 365.25 days, right? 1 year it takes, no, to go around the sun. So we know the orbital speed of the Earth, which turns out to be around 25 kilometers per second. Okay, every second the Earth is going 25 kilometers around the sun. Okay, so this blue arrow stands for the Earth's speed. Okay, and if there is light coming from a star, when the light enters a telescope, if the star was this star, okay, and if the light was coming in a straight line like this, the time the light enters this telescope, well, these telescopes were very their field of view was very narrow. Okay, like field of view is this concept, right? People who do photography must be aware of this concept, right? How much you see basically from your camera, right? So their field of views were typically very narrow. Huh? So when a light would enter a telescope, when the light enters the telescope here, by the time the light goes down here to the objective lens, or where the astronomer is sitting, the telescope would have moved in the forward direction, right? In some by some tiny finite amount. Huh? And that would mean that that light would hit this upper wall of the telescope and not reach this place. So basically, when you see any light coming and reaching the astronomer's eye, basically that light is coming from a different source. This is a bit exaggerated. So if the light is coming this way, the light entered the telescope here. When the light reached here, the telescope was here. When the light reached here, the telescope was here. So basically, the light manages to reach the place where the astronomer is looking at. Hey, but this particular angle, which is exaggerated here, is really tiny. That angle is actually 40 seconds, arc seconds. 40 arc seconds is like one arc minute is 1/60th of a degree. One arc second is 1/60th of an arc minute, which is like 1 by 3,600 of a degree, a tiny amount. So 40 arc seconds, it's a very tiny angle, but their measurement devices were good enough to detect this consistent tiny angle. So from this, basically, he was able to find the speed of light, doing a very simple classical mechanics kind of a simple um, um, kind of a calculation. It's interesting to note here that Bradley was relying on Newton's theory of light, which was that light is a particle. So he was talking about a particle of light entering the telescope and then coming down and traveling this way so that it doesn't hit the upper walls of the telescope and so on. He was in that frame, okay, of Newton's particle theory, or not particle theory that we talk about today, but the kind of corpuscular theory of light. No, he was in that frame. Okay, anyway, so he was able to calculate the speed of light. He didn't set out to measure the speed of light, but he kind of ends up measuring it to a very good, very almost 300 years ago, right? 1720. Fairly accurate value of speed of light. Okay, instead of parallax, he ends up measuring something else. Very useful, very interesting, huh? But then you can ask me what about stellar parallax? What about parallax of stars? This was only done in the 1830s, which is like more than 200 years, 100 year after Bradley, by this person, German person called Bessel, who is very well known for his work in math and physics, Bessel's functions and so on. Bessel, by this person, and which was a big kind of a leap for astronomy, for observational astronomy and so on. um, and then well, this is fine. We can say that these two measurements were basically measurements done accidentally, or contingent measurements. They didn't mean to measure the speed of light, but they ended up measuring the speed of light using stuff that is happening in the skies, right? But then didn't people try to measure the speed of light on Earth, like what Galileo had proposed, right? Galileo had proposed, standing on two hills and using those lanterns and so on. No? Did other people try to measure the speed of light and so on? No? Yes, and there were, like, Galileo failed, or probably he didn't even do that experiment, and even the other people from Florence Academy of Sciences, they also failed to do a measurement of speed of light on the Earth, or a terrestrial measurement of speed of light. But this fellow called Fizeau, well, Fizeau was the son of a scientist, a physicist, as well as a doctor, I think. His father left him a lot of money, and he didn't have to, worry about earning a living and so on. But then he went to university. He had many of these very famous French scientists as his teachers. I think some of you might have heard these names: Poisson, Biot, Bio, that one, Bio. Then some other people also, Arago, François Arago, Arago. Arago was a very, very big influence on Fizeau. In fact, it was Arago who gave Fizeau this idea of how to measure the speed of light, and at least not the direct idea, but an inkling of the idea, because Arago had followed the work of of a British uh, scientist. His name is Wheatstone, and probably people would remember Wheatstone's bridge from 12th standard. So Wheatstone did much more work than just that Wheatstone's bridge, which is used to find the value of an unknown resistance. Wheatstone was a contemporary of Michael Faraday, who did so much work in physics and chemistry, right? Michael Faraday. Uh, Wheatstone was a colleague of Michael Faraday. Well, Michael Faraday himself, we know, was the son of a blacksmith and a bookbinder's apprentice who was kind of cited by Humphrey Davy, the chemist, because he had wonderful notes. And then David got him released from the bookbinder and got him to the Royal Society, and then he started off there. So Faraday used to deliver all Wheatstone's lectures, but anyway, that's aside. So Wheatstone had tried something, a way of measuring not the speed of light, but measuring the speed of an electrical impulse in a wire, in a very, very long wire. And if I think some of you might have heard about this term, the term is stroboscopy, stroboscopic light, like those fast flashes, like an aeroplane has those fast, quick flashes, no? Or sometimes you see this weird kind of movement of the ceiling fan when you have a bad tube light which blinks, no? That kind of Those kind of ideas are broadly called as stroboscopic strobe effect or something like that. So Wheatstone invented the strobe effect, and François Arago who was Fizeau's professor, wanted to use that to measure the speed of light, those ideas. But then Arago went blind, and he couldn't do those experiments. But then he inspired Fizeau and Foucault, another person, not the sociologist Michel Foucault, but another Foucault, Jean Foucault, who is known for other things also, to try to measure the speed of light. So what is this Fizeau's idea? So the basic idea is this: over here you have a light source. Fizeau didn't have a bulb, okay, of course. He didn't have a bulb. I think he was using sunlight. I have not checked it. Okay, so basically you take a source of light, you get a beam of light, and you make that light go and hit a mirror which is far away. And he did this experiment in Paris, and I think the distance that he used was around 8 miles or 10 miles, something like that. So he wanted the time to find the time light takes to go from this source, to reflect from this mirror, to come back, get reflected by this. This is formally called a beam splitter, but basically it's a mirror that partially reflects and partially allows light to go through it. But even when you look at a simple glass, a window glass also, you can see a reflection as well as you can see something beyond it. No, but this is a special kind of a glass which is called a beam splitter in modern day parlance. Okay, so he used this beam splitter. Why? Because when the light came back, well, you had to look at the light, right? So this is something like a lens through which we can look at the light. But what he used here was his main kind of interesting invention. Okay, he used a notched wheel like a gear. No, so how many notches did this wheel have? It had like a huge number of equally spaced notches, around 720 notches. But why did he use this notched gear or notched wheel? The idea was he wanted to chop up the light into, like, okay, now the light can go and hit the mirror and come back, and now I'm blocking the light. Okay, something like that. So he went on adjusting the speed of rotation of this wheel. It's I think it's a nuanced point. I may not be able to clearly convey it right now, but the idea is that once light goes through, some light goes through this and comes back. If it comes back when the position of the wheel is such that it's blocking the light, you won't be able to see the light here, right? But if it comes back in such a in after such a time, so that the wheel rotates a bit, and now the adjacent, maybe the adjacent, it's coming through the adjacent opening, no? So by changing the speed of rotation of this notched wheel, he could get this basically when we can see this, that can and knowing the distance that can give, and the speed of rotation of this wheel, he was able to calculate the speed of light, and pretty good. I would say only 5% off from what we have it today. This was Fizeau in 1849, and I told you this Jean Foucault was another of Arago's students or mentees, and Fizeau and Foucault in fact worked together, but then they fell apart and they became rivals and so on. But I'll talk about, this is another interesting book. Okay, Michelson and the Speed of Light. This book was written in the 60s when USA and USSR were locked into the, what do we call it, the space kind of race, all that. So there was so many science education efforts in the US to kind of play, because Sputnik had already, so one of these, this was a series of books and series of articles and stuff that came in the 60s. So this particular book is very interesting. So this is Fizeau's apparatus, which is, the book is kind of in all the details. Okay, and we'll not talk about this. I'll go ahead. And what I'm trying to say is that this is still being used today. And if you go to many of these physics labs in, say, ISC or some other place, TIFR or some other place, then you'll basically, some of the people working in optics or some other stuff would be using something called an optical chopper, which is basically a wheel which rotates at a very, very specific speed. And this is a typical setup using a lock-in amplifier, which is called, it's a beautiful device which can very sensitive, if you have a noise which is million times larger than the signal that you are trying to measure, it can still retrieve this signal or the interesting stuff from the sea of noise. Okay, so something like this optical chopper, which is Fizeau's idea, still being used today. Okay, that's what I'm trying to point that I'm going to make. Okay, then coming to Foucault, right? Foucault, friend turned foe, friend turned rival of Fizeau. His idea was different. He didn't use a notched wheel. He used a rotating mirror. Okay, so the idea was that light would come from a source, hit this mirror, huh, and then when the mirror is in this position, it would hit the mirror and go towards this far away another mirror, which is placed so that it is going to reflect the light back. So light is going to come back after reflecting from this other mirror M. But by the time it comes back, this mirror which is rotating would have already rotated by a tiny amount of angle, right? So, which means that we wouldn't be able to see the light coming back exactly the way it went. If this mirror was stationary, then the light would go, hit this mirror, come back exactly the way it started off. No, but if this mirror is rotating, then for the finite amount of time that the light takes to go here and come back, in that time this mirror would have rotated by a known amount. Known amount in the sense that we know the speed of rotation of the mirror. So then this light which will come back would come back at some other place and not where it started off from. So then, which means that basically by knowing the speed of rotation of the mirror and so on and this deflection, we can get the speed of light because the distance between these two is known. So going and coming twice that distance, that much distance light travels, and in that time that light takes to travel from this distance and come back, this mirror rotates by a given angle, some angle, and from this deflection we can get that angle and find the speed of light. Okay, this was Foucault's idea. This is another kind of a small gif that I found, that light, this is a simplified of course gif, that light goes from the candle, hits the mirror, goes to this mirror, comes back, but by the time it comes back, the mirror, this mirror has rotated, so it doesn't go back to the candle but is deflected slightly, you know, that way. Interesting gif I found. Okay, so Foucault's setup in all of its complexity is this, which we don't need to discuss right now. But we need to talk about Michelson because he's known for many great things that he did. Michelson was the son of a Polish immigrant in a very impoverished family. Ran a grocery store kind of a thing for people who were going west for that gold rush. People must have seen this my Charlie Chaplin's movie, right? Gold Rush. I forgot the name of the movie. But anyway, so a very poor family, but Michelson ended up being a cadet in the Navy, U.S. Navy, and then became an instructor in the U.S. Navy. And one of the things that he wanted to reproduce is Foucault's experiment, and he just didn't reproduce it. He improved upon it so much that his measurement of speed of light became the standard for next 40 years almost, like the most I think, and he broke his own record later on using interferometry in the meantime. So anyway, so this was Michelson, and we'll not go into the details for now, but this is some experiment that students, undergraduate students typically do in a place like IISc, which is why I got into all of this, because I was teaching students there. So which students around the world are doing this kind of an experiment, some simplified version of which can be done in a big enough lab. Basically, you just need basically 10-15 meters long room, and you can do this experiment. For the rotating mirror, you can just basically stick a mirror to maybe a the shaft of a drilling machine or something like that. No, so it's very simple enough to reproduce actually today, but wonderful that you can measure the speed of light, huge, in a simple lab, basically. But while I was talking about that, I forgot to mention this, that we were talking about Newton's wave theory and Huygens, Christian Huygens, the Dutch fellow we mentioned earlier, his wave theory. So for the entire 1700s, Newton's corpuscular theory or particle theory of light was the thing which was the most popular, and people didn't take Huygens theory, wave theory, that light is a wave, very seriously. In fact, even Arago didn't take it very seriously. It was this person called Fresnel, who was a civil engineer and a scientist. Fresnel, French person, who did a presentation in front of Arago in the university. Arago, Poinsot, Biot, whatever, other people. And basically, he was someone who tried to revive Huygens wave theory of light, that light is a wave and so on. Thomas Young, a British person around 1800, did a very, very important experiment, which kind of was a very, very strong, extremely strong evidence for the wave theory, which is, I think this is well known, Young's double slit experiment, okay, in which you see something called an interference pattern, which can be seen only if light is a wave, and can't see that if light is a particle that way. Huh? So these were kind of wave. There's a very interesting story. Basically, Poisson, whatever, the mathematician physicist Poisson, threw a challenge to Fresnel when Fresnel talked about the wave theory. There are various versions. One version is that it was a drunken challenge, that it was a party and so on, and they were drunk, and Poisson gave this challenge that, if someone is shooting at you, someone is shooting arrows or bullets at you with a gun, where would you hide behind? So he would say you would obviously hide behind a rock, no? So he was trying to make a kind of a argument that if light is a wave, then basically you should see a bright spot in the shadow of a spherical or a circular object. Okay, and this is he was trying to mock Fresnel actually, but Arago said that okay, let's do this experiment, and he actually did this experiment and found that spot, and now the joke was on Poisson. So the spot which can be seen, it's not very difficult to set this up. It's known as Poisson spot or Arago spot or Fresnel spot. Okay, but very interesting, which was a very clinching evidence for the wave theory. But anyway, I thought I should talk about it because we were talking about Arago. So there was one more thing that Arago was interested, because Arago and Fresnel and others were thinking about the wave theory of light. No, so they because saying, well, the wave, then the speed of light is less in medium like water. So they wanted to find the speed of light. That was the final coffin in the nail in the coffin of Newton's corpuscular theory. So we saw that all of these people in different places, and of course, I forgot to put in Michelson, who is in the U.S. Naval Academy in Maryland, and Denmark, in Italy, Paris. Paris seems to be a really big hub. All of these people, talking each other's letters, papers, articles, engaging in this process, and living in a certain political social scenario, right? Political in the sense that, hey, our person Ole Romer had to leave Paris even after being the tutor of the crown prince for like almost 10 years. He had to leave because he was a Protestant, right? So many other things, like Galileo's own travels and his struggles, Bradley, this, all these things. So this is very, I just mean to say that these things are not like a bolt from the blue, they are not just dropped from the skies, there is continuity, right? There is some, you build upon some other work, you think about these, you argue, you further argue, you try out things. This is a very, it's a process, right? So this kind of question I wanted to kind of pose, and I also wanted to pose a question like this. Is it just merely series of happy coincidences? No, right? For example, Galileo failed, right? Or you can even say that Arago went blind. I mean, it's not happy, right? Then Bradley could not find parallax. Someone else 100 years later found parallax. No, it's not just, and then I did this, so then suddenly something else happened. No, it's not just about a happy coincidence happening. So I wanted to pose this question. I also wanted to pose this question because this is a very popular image of a scientist, a public image of a scientist. Of course, a scientist, revered scientists, who are like, not like common people, But is this kind of an image of a scientist as a lone warrior who's kind of pursuing the truth all the time. Is this really accurate? Is this really valid? Because given the complexity of the world that they live in, no? So given the collaborations, given how much they depend on others also on their work and so on, no? For example, I wanted to and moving on, I wanted to quote this from Isidore Rabi, the Nobel laureate, nuclear magnetic resonance. He got the Nobel Prize for that, and of course MRI machines work because of that. And he's known for because he said that he famously he said these words in an interview that my mother made me a scientist, because every day in he lived in Brooklyn in New York, in a Jew, which is, and his family was a Jewish immigrant family, right? And all the mothers of in Brooklyn would ask their children, "What did you learn at school today?" And Isidore Rabi said his mother asked him, "Izzy, what did you ask at school today?" So he says that my mother taught me to ask good questions, and that is probably why I became a scientist and so on. A lot of interesting stuff that he's done. But in the preface of a book, he's given this very interesting quote, and I feel like reading it. I'll read it. I propose that science be taught at whatever level, from the lowest to the highest, in the humanistic way. It should be taught with a certain historical understanding, with a certain philosophical understanding, a certain social understanding, and a human understanding, in the sense of the biography, the nature of the people who made this construction, the triumphs, the trials, the tribulations, and so on. So I felt like including this quote. I also wanted to include this quote by our contemporary philosopher of science, Sundar Sarukai, who's done a lot of work and interesting stuff. I think Vitasta, you use his book, right, for your course, What is Science? So his quote, I just wanted to put this quote. This is from not from that book. It's from a different paper. If instead of packaging science as is done in our school textbooks now, the same content were presented through a larger framework of human and social interactions through the disciplines of social science and humanities, we might have students with a deeper understanding of science. Okay, this is what he is saying, and many other interesting things also. And this is something that I have come to realize recently because of my engagement with the work in science education. I really appreciate this particular point of view, looking at science as enculturation. What do we mean by enculturation? For example, I was just today morning, I broke open a coconut, okay, and I grated it. This is something that I learned at home, because this is what was happening, and it was like an everyday thing to do, or I would say cleaning fish is something that I don't have to be trained, it was just happening around me. I was in that culture, it's part of my cultural experience that way. So for example, some feminist critiques of science, someone called Barton says that she reflects on her experience of learning, say, quantum mechanics as an undergrad, a grad students as well. She did very well academically. She scored A's all throughout, but then she felt that it never felt as if quantum mechanics is for me, in the sense that you couldn't feel like you are part of that, or that is part of you, or that your world. And she was making a point that this is something which was done by European men in a certain period of time, which for which entering that culture is something very far for a person. I think she's not a white person in America. I think for a minority member, female person. So she had no ways of getting enculturated into that world. No? So that is, I feel, that is an interesting argument for studying the history and philosophy of science while studying science itself. So this idea of enculturated into getting enculturated into the culture of science. For example, an undergraduate or a grad student in a good physics department would have these talks happening in that department every week, more than one talk, and people coming from all over talking about their work, and they observe people who are talking about their work, doing their work, discussing their work, doing experiments, doing theory, everything. So they're living in that culture where physics is being done. No? So getting enculturated, and there's another term called without assimilation. Like, it's not like you leave everything behind of what you are, your identity. you still keep that, because there are these questions of hegemony, right, between the dominant knowledge systems and the other knowledge systems and so on. So it's like enculturation without assimilation. I think this is a very interesting term. No? So and if you look at science, not just in terms of learning concepts, have you got this concept correctly? It's beyond that. It's getting into the culture of science, getting the practices, the cultural practices. How do you talk about it? How do you make sense of what's been discussed? These kind of tools of engaging in this discourse about science. So I would like to point to these very interesting stuff about science and technology in India. Of course, there's this beautiful book called Carnival for Science by Shiv Vishwanathan. It's a critique of science, actually. Very interesting book. Then Sundar Sarukai's book, which I haven't read fully, but I plan to read, in which he draws parallels and ideas from Indian philosophy and the philosophy of science. And then this is the very important book done by this Gandhian person called Dharampal, who spent a decade in London going through the records of the correspondence of officers of the British East India Company in India House. They have that place. No? And he went through the records and the letters that these officers wrote back to London, in which they spoke about the kind of science, technology stuff that was being done. And this is available. For example, it's there on Arvind Gupta's website. This Indian Science and Technology in the 18th or 17th, I'm not sure now. And this is a very important series, 13 episode series directed by Chandrika Mukherjee in 1989. Many other people apart from her, of course, collaborated and did this work. Wonderful, which is available on YouTube, Bharat Ki Chhap. Unfortunately, it used to be, I think, screened after 1989, Mahabharat. So no one, everyone switched off their television set. But this is really very good work, which is basically on science and technology in India. They start from the Harappan civilization and till contemporary times. I think Professor Yashpal has also made some interesting appearances in one of few of these episodes. Okay, and then I would like to end with this quote by Kancha Ilaiah, because I think it's very. I think we need to reflect on these things when we talk about science in India, in our society. And I would like to read it. This is work done by, this is illustrated by Karen Haydock. So, over a period, with every labor oriented activity treated as undignified, the educated sections of society forgot that the fact that labor is the source of life. Because of the denial of education and writing to the laboring castes, science did not develop to a more advanced stage in India. This is Kancha Ilaiah's statement in, I think, 2007. I think he made this statement in a book called Dignity of Labor in Our Times, Tilling the Soil. Sorry, what is the, I forgot the first title. Eklavya has brought this book out in Hindi, Hamare Samay Mein Shram Ki Garima. It's a really beautifully illustrated book, illustrated by Durgabai Vyam, the Gond artist. So anyway, I would like to stop here and then we can talk about other things. And I'll thank all of you. I thank Vitasta, thank Karthik, thank Professor Kaushal Verma and others in the Office of Communication for this opportunity. Thanks a lot. So I'll stop presenting, okay? Thanks.
Thank you, Anish, for again
Hello.
a very interesting lecture. And
Thank
the few questions you posed at the end,
you.
are very, important questions on how we look at science and how we think about science and about how we do science. So let's open the chat box for questions. And as I said that I will read out the questions. I'll prefer reading out the questions, and
Sure. Okay.
I request the attendees to pose the questions in the chat box.
I think I
There were a
overshot the
few.
time. No? I
No,
overshot the
that's
time.
fine.
Hmm.
Um, that's fine. There was a question some time ago. I can't now recall the context by somebody called Sony Soman Uman. He was asking, wasn't the heliocentric? I don't know what context was he asking this in.
Mhm.
Okay, there's one question that has come. I'll
Maybe
just read it out.
can that person repeat that question maybe,
Yeah.
or is it somewhere
Okay,
out
I'll
there in the chat?
yeah.
Uh, wasn't the Yeah, I can read it. Wasn't the heliocentric model of the solar system established before being able to establish, deduce the speed of light, discrepancy of ions? Right, right. You're right, Sony. Son, you're right. It was, but it wasn't accepted yet. For example, when one of the evidence which I mentioned was the phases of Venus, which was around 1610 or 1613 by Galileo, and someone else also. I feel some others also verified it. So phases of Venus was definitely a big evidence for that, for the heliocentric model. There were other evidences as well. I'm not able to recall right now on top of my mind. You're right, Sonia. But still people were looking for more evidence. We can basically imagine how strong that was, the geocentric model was, huh? For example, Copernicus, who was like almost 100 years before Galileo, only published his model uh, only a few years before he died. Okay, basically he didn't want to get into trouble either, I think. And I think there was someone else, I forget the name, who was probably burnt at the stake for this. Was actually Galileo was luckier. He got away with house arrest. One of the reasons was, he was close to the Pope. The current Pope was also from Florence, Galileo's home area, and he was Galileo's admirer also. And there was a lot of pressure on the Pope to do something about what Galileo is saying. Show something. You have to do something about it. So, and there was many other things that I couldn't mention. For example, a recent, not very recent book called Galileo's Daughter. Probably have you heard about this book? I think some of you might have heard about this book. So Galileo had a daughter from not his wife, his companion in Padua, which is close to Venice, and two daughters and a son. And both the daughters went on to become nuns because they were so-called illegitimate, so they didn't have any prospects of marrying. And so one of the daughters was very interested in Galileo's work, and they had a very good correspondence. And this book, Galileo's Daughter, is based on 120 letters, I think, written by Galileo to her, or the vice versa. One of the two sets doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, the next question is Anusha wants you to reflect about your experience of working with IISc.
Okay. What kind of experience? Basically, I enjoyed myself because working with students is something a privilege. You get to learn with the students and understand what they feel about the studies. Try to support them. And unfortunately, there has been some trends in which students are under a lot of pressure at IISc nowadays, probably more. Right from the first semester, probably they are thinking about getting perfect scores and going to the top universities. So I forget who was it. One of these American scientists. I forget who is it, who has said that if you want to learn, you should learn to forget about your grades a little bit. Anyway, but my experience was nice. I really enjoyed myself. If there's something specific, Anusha, then you can ask me. Thanks. So, should I go to the next question, Vitasta? Susan,
Yes,
Susan
yeah,
has
you can read it.
as a
You can read it,
physicist,
Anish.
how do you
Yeah, you can
value
read it yourself.
science, and also what would you advise to fellow physicists? Mm, well, how do I value science? I okay. Mm, I value science as maybe one of the aspects, an important aspect of human civilization. We have come all of this way, even with the problems, with all of these problems. You can't really blame science for global warming, science and technology. But I probably, the way we have arranged our society, what is the relation of science and scientists with the powers that be? For example, I would say, like, if a scientist slash engineer at MIT, which actually happens, gets Department of Energy or Department of Defense contract funding for developing drones, then are you going to accept that or not? These are decisions that you can take or cannot take based on your relations with the system and all that. So scientists have been grappling with these issues. Is science answerable to society, or is science only a service oriented? You just tell us what you want and we'll give it to you, kind of a thing. What is the interaction of science, society, scientists, their work, the cultures within which people do the work? For example, unfortunately, many places in India, for example, a new PhD student comes into a lab and gets enculturated into the lab culture. Is that person, is enough mentoring happening there? No? Do they get the support that is needed? Enough time from their peers and their advisors? These are very important issues which of hierarchy, even in our everyday systems. These are important things that we need to still work on, I feel. Advice, I don't have any advice for fellow physicists, but thanks. Thank you for the question. Should I read, Manoj? आश्रम
Yeah,
शाला
you
में
can.
बच्चों को विज्ञान को समझने के प्रयासों के बारे में आपके अनुभव के बारे में बताएं। बच्चों को और युवाओं को पढ़ाने में क्या चुनौतियां हैं और क्या उम्मीद है? So I'll maybe translate in English. Basically, Manoj Nigam basically is my colleague at Eklavya in Bhopal, and we have been working for the past 2.5, 3 years with ashram schools, which are schools for tribal children in Maharashtra, in all the remote areas of Maharashtra, with mainly the teachers. And me personally, I have met mostly teachers and not children, but I have heard a lot about other people, other colleagues who regularly go to the school. So Manoj's question is that what are my experiences of those ashram, learning science in ashram schools, and what are the basic challenges for working with children and youth, and what are the hopes, basically? So yeah, like, this is a nice question. Actually, I would say that yes, especially in an ashram school, in a school which is coming from this colonial kind of thing, no, of civilizing the uncivilized. No, children will come here, Adivasi children will come here, they will get civilized, they will learn the proper language, and they will be, they will move out of their community. That kind of a brown man's burden, civilizing mission, is still there in us today. So that is a big that system is a big, in a big kind of impasse. So there has to be a lot of pressure. The thing is that the system is problematic because it looks down condescendingly at Adivasi people and their communities and their knowledge systems, also their ways of living. But then many a times, because of the current situation of Adivasi communities, for many families, they have to migrate in search of work to small towns or big cities, and this becomes like a place to leave. This ashram school becomes like a place to leave the children behind, so that they will get food and shelter, and there'll be a community of other children. So yes, these children come with their experiences of from their communities. For example, their knowledge of trees and herbs, their knowledge about animals, about the forest. But unfortunately, this knowledge is not acknowledged and given the kind of respect that should be given. It not doesn't become part of the curriculum. That is a big challenge. The hope, I feel, is that well, it's a bleak situation, but the hope is that um, there are many people who want to engage with these issues, and I feel that even from within the Adivasi communities, children who receive an education and reflect on their own education and their relation with their communities are trying to change things. And as non Adivasis, I think we should do our best to assist them in whatever way possible. I don't know, Manoj bhai, मैंने आपके सवाल का जवाब दिया कि नहीं? Thank you. So, is there anything? Okay. Nikhil,
Yeah,
hello Nikhil.
there are questions. Yeah.
Okay. How do you motivate and promote your students from Eklavya coming in places like ISC and IITs? And would that change the course of problems that they could have identified in their own niche? Okay. It's a big ask, I would say, because uh, one, the term that I used earlier, enculturation without assimilation, right? So you don't want to leave behind what you are, and you still want that cultural experience of learning science, of engaging with science. So it is a big thing, and many of us have to work together to make these things happen. But do we really consider coming into ISC and IITs or other institutes as success, or do we as a society recognize an individual and his or her own sense making about science and other fields to be the center of his or her own education, no? So that those questions I do have. Would that change the course of? Yeah, that may not change everything. I agree. So many of these questions don't have a one answer, right? A one line answer. But I would like to discuss further. What would your advice be to a student who aspires to be a researcher, like how to study the subject and practice experiments? Oh, experiments! Oh my God! Basically, it's a difficult time for doing experiments in our country. Like hardly anyone is doing experiments. Basically, in after 10th standard or even 10th, 11th, 12th, people are just obviously we know that, right? That has become the unofficial curriculum. The stuff which is who is a good teacher is basically someone who can prepare you for success in a competitive exam like IIT JEE or NEET or something like that, no? So these are larger issues, and unfortunately it's not a very good time for doing experiments in our country. But how to study the subject, I would say that discuss things, ask questions, and don't get discouraged by, because science is complicated. The more you engage with science, the more questions you will have. Like I think CV Raman's "Why the Sky is Blue," that talk is really interesting to read. That talk, the PDF is available on Arvind Gupta's website, on Raman Research Institute's website also. "Why the Sky is Blue," CV Raman. Basically, this is a talk which he gave to school students while inaugurating the Vikram Sarabhai Community Science Center in Ahmedabad in 69, or I forget, 70, something like that. And he is kind of unpacking what is learning science, how one question leads to another, and how you engage in questions and how you come back to your original question. This process of science, I think that engagement is necessary for all students also. But unfortunately, that can't happen in a vacuum. The student needs an atmosphere, that a school atmosphere or a family atmosphere or some other atmosphere that allows this engagement and this meeting of students' home experience and school experience, the science syllabus, new things, maybe from primary sources, from reading from Galileo's book, that kind of meeting place, that kind of physical or non-physical space has to happen. Those are larger systemic issues, I feel. Um, Manoranjan has asking a question. In Fizo's experiment, the distance between the lens and the reflector is around 5 miles or so, as we know. There is a line of Earth, is it? Okay. Could you please elaborate more on the setup? Curious to know the setup. Fine, we can talk about it. Should we talk about it right now, Vitasta? We have some time.
Yeah, go on, Anish.
Okay, sure. So then I'll have to go back to the presentation. Quickly, I'll try to do this. Huh? Okay, I think. Okay, so piezo setup, right? Okay, so what I'll just try to explain so that it's the basic idea that your source of light, that light may be coming from a hole in a screen. Okay, that this light coming from a hole in a screen. Okay, this light is going all all spreading all over. You want to make a beam of light, okay, for which you use this typically a short focal length lens, convex lens typically. Um, there are other issues also, that lens has to be achromatic, no? That it shouldn't basically split the colors. It should still remain white light. It shouldn't split the colors. That chromatic or other, say, spherical aberration, that shouldn't happen. Hey, but all this had happened, okay, right from the 13th century till Fizeau's time, 19th century. The work in lens making and making good lenses had progressed a lot, so they could make these lenses, okay. So this lens basically makes a beam of light which is reflected from this beam splitter, as we say, no. So it's reflected from this place. So and it's reflected in such a way that this lens is trying to focus that beam again at this point, so that when it passes through the wheel, it's only a short, that opening between two of those wheel, whatever those notches. When it's passing through that wheel opening, no, it should not be a big beam of light. It should be a short kind of a. It should be a focused kind of a beam, focused light at that point. Okay, so it passes through that wheel. Sometimes get blocked, sometimes passes. So the chunks of light that pass through that wheel notches, through the notches, again they go and hit a lens, which now makes a parallel beam of light. Okay, this is a parallel beam of light. So it's a nice parallel beam of light. So there are certain ways in which we can basically, the distance at which you need to keep this lens from this total distance, so that we get a parallel beam of light. So that needs to be taken care of. Then again, when it reaches near that other faraway mirror, it has to be focused back on the mirror, so that it will reflect back the same way. This mirror is stationary, okay. It will reflect back the same way, again get focused back, okay, into a tiny spot. But now when it gets focused back and in a tiny spot, if the speed at which this wheel is rotating is not right, then this light will get blocked, and then you won't be able to see anything through this lens, okay. But if the speed of rotation is just right, so that the light which goes and comes back, by the time it comes back, this has rotated a tiny bit, so that now the next opening is there, and now the light can come in, no. So this is, I don't know whether I have answered the question, but this was my attempt. But we can, I can maybe give my email address here if someone wants to talk about this in detail. Okay, I'll write my email address. Thank you.
Anish, there are two more
Yeah.
questions. Would you like to
Okay,
take them?
sure. Sure, yeah, I
Yeah,
don't have a problem.
one is from Srinath.
Okay.
Srinath has asked, Anish, regarding the Adivasi education, what is your opinion about the new education policy? Will it reduce the current gap?
Well, I have not. I have to be frank. I have not really read a lot about the new. Although it's not a very big document, I have been lazy enough not to read it. But I feel that from what I have heard, I'm hopeful that something new will happen. Hopefully, people have thought about. We know Kasturi Rangan and our other mathematician from Stanford, Manu Prakash. No, not Manu Prakash. Other person. His name. Uh, Vitasta in CCS. They had come. No, to give a
Yeah.
talk, right? So we know that they went about doing things with the best of intentions. However, I don't know what has that resulted in. For example, one critique has been by opening this door of what is this called, vocational education much earlier in middle school, at the end of middle school. Are we kind of going to make a segregation like what happened in the schools of Prussia? No, different school for the nobility, or different school for the soldiers and lower classes, working classes. So that is one. I feel that is one thing that has to be taken care of. But I have not. Sorry, Srinath, I have not read about whether the NEP talks about the Adivasi education as such. But what I feel is that we need to have more voice of Adivasi communities and children, their families, and understand their interpretation of this scenario. What is, what the world that they are living in, and how they would like their children's education to be, right? Like for you and me, we think we are, relatively we have a choice of deciding how our children will learn, what kind of a school they will go to, those things. Will they also get know, will Adivasi communities also get the same choice, or can we work towards a world, a situation where they can exercise such a choice and decide stuff, what is, you know, how the education of their children will happen. Hmm. Okay.
Anish,
Finally,
we'll take the last question.
sure.
Rajas also has a question, but he can discuss with you later,
Okay,
maybe.
sure.
We'll
Rajesh.
take another the other question. In your opinion, how big of a role does language play in
Oh,
encouraging or discouraging the process of
seriously,
learning
this is a
science?
really good question. I really appreciate this question. Well, for one, for example, I want to give you an example of, I forget it, was it Mendeleev, the person who made the periodic table, or some other Russian in the middle of the 19th century, 1850s, worked very hard to develop a vocabulary, a scientific vocabulary in Russian, a vocabulary which was not a mere uh, translation, literal translation of some Latinized or some English term, but something which is abstract enough to be used in everyday parlance. No, so I feel, for example, if you look at the Indian language textbooks of science, for example, writing in science in Indian language, there has been wonderful work in Indian languages. People have written about science, but unfortunately, the kind of science which is discussed, the line of language in which science is discussed in Indian languages, in school science especially, is like another hurdle for students, and it's very, very difficult. This terminology itself is a big problem. But as you point out, the role of language is beyond terminology, probably, and the ability to discuss science in not in a trivialized way, but to engage in a discourse, nuanced discourse of science, in which we ask questions, we pose questions, think about things. We need those tools, no, these linguistic, or as Vygotsky has said, semiotic tools to engage in science, in the cultures of science. No, so that I feel, yes, language has a big role to play, and I feel this kind of hybrid thing, of using English and using our discussing, say, in our mother tongues, science, using English terms, is something that people in India have been trying slowly. But yeah, this is an important point, language. I agree. Thank you for that question. Okay, Bitasta. Should we
Yeah, I
just?
think Anish,
Okay, Rajesh. Okay, Rajesh.
you want
Okay,
to take the
Rajesh.
question? You can go ahead if you want.
How did Fizo even align something? That's seriously, Rajesh. Like, for someone who, for how difficult it is to align stuff even on an optical bench, no? Right. This is a good question, Rajesh. I think we'll have to look into Fizo's original paper. The thing is that the book that I mentioned, a source book of physics by William Francis Magee, 1940-1930, which is there on some websites and all. It doesn't give the entire paper of Fizo. I think his paper must be in French. I'm sure someone must have translated the entire paper in English, but definitely this is a important thing. Yeah, exactly. If you want to make it like collimated, not even a laser, right? Exactly. Even a laser doesn't stay collimated for such a. I wonder how he did that. I wonder too. Thanks for this. Yeah.
Okay, the
Okay.
questions are pouring in now. I think we should
Oh, sorry,
call it a
sorry.
day.
Okay,
What do
Arav.
what do
Okay, I
you?
can talk to Arav. I know Arav. Okay.
Gaurav Solra is
Gaurav
also
also, I
asked a
know
question.
Gaurav. And okay. Yes, Manoj bhai, recording will be there.
Yeah,
Um,
recording will be available. It will be up on the ISA website
okay.
in few days.
Conflicts between
Uh,
different knowledge systems. Yeah, Gaurav, absolutely. And in, positive, negative senses is really confusing today, actually. Right? What is that name of that Swami? Who ran away?
Nityanand.
Nityanand, right?
Nityanand. Yeah.
That's so. How do we engage with such a discourse? Right? That's so. Yeah, it's important to engage with such a discourse because it is a popular discourse, right? And I feel scientists can't remain aloof and stay and in take a position, elite position, that we don't care and whatever. These people are fools. That way, we have to engage. Scientists have to engage with the discourse and understand why that discourse is appealing to people. And other knowledge systems, for example, science become a hegemonic knowledge system? In fact, recently I've been reading about this person, Farah Ben. No, what is the spelling? I forget. What is that, right? Farah Ben. something like that. And he has really interesting critiques of science. He has critiqued is there a method for science? There are many scientific methods. Firstly, a lot of work on this already been done. Like if there is a scientific method, the scientific method of a particular lab, and the lab maybe a physics lab only next to it, or a theory group, might be completely different. Within the subfields of physics, between particle physics and between ecology, the kind of scientific methods, or even the way the epistemic kind of stances of these fields would be completely different. No? So yeah, this question is important. And of course, when we talk about knowledge systems, some knowledge systems have they been historically been oppressed or not recognized? No, these questions are important, and Michel Foucault has talked about it, for example. Other people also. No? Yeah, definitely. Arav, why can't light travel in curved lines? Why only straight lines? You can make light curved, and why can't it naturally travel in a curved line? A very good question, actually. A really good question. And actually, people have engaged with these ideas. Um, for example, maybe it's a bit too much for you. For example, if you can look at later on how Feynman talks about, something called least action. There are certain other ways of looking at this also. Formats, from principle, So we can talk about this later, Arav. I'll talk to Arav later, Bethesda.
Okay, Anish. So shall we call it a day today?
Yeah. So thank you, everyone.
Yes.
Thanks, Bethesda. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Anish. Thank you. And we hope to have you again for another lecture
I
very
would
soon.
love to. I would love to, and maybe maybe he can
Yes,
also
the
participate
baby.
next time.
Yes, next time, sure. Let me
Okay.
take a screenshot.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks a
Anish, thank
lot.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.